Hello again, and welcome to part 2 of our lecture on chapter 4, quantitative designs. So in part 1 of our lecture, we broke down some different categories and umbrella terms of different types of quantitative studies. And in part 2 of this lecture, we're going to go into some specific components of quantitative studies and really do a deep dive into the experimental design, which is a subset of quantitative designs. So to start, I want to talk about causality in research because an important feature of design is determining the type of relationship that a study will investigate. And in order for you to answer the type of relationship that is being investigated, researchers often attempt to establish a causal relationship between variables of interest, which refers to an attempt made by a researcher to determine that one or more variables has changed or caused the change in another variable. Most often, what we're talking about in this case is that a change in your independent variable has resulted in changes in your dependent variable. And that is what we call causality. And in research design, especially in quantitative studies, they are known for establishing causality, or at least seeking to establish causality. Because as a researcher, we want to say that one of our variables is causing a change in the other. And there are two specific types of causal research studies in the field of psychology. The first of those is what we call nomothetic research. And nomothetic research aims at arriving at causal relationships that are easily applied to the population at large. So, oftentimes, nomothetic research is quantitative because it has a much larger scope and it has larger samples of participants. Also, we say that nomothetic research oftentimes is quantitative because we are establishing that people in a broad category will experience this thing. So, a good example of nomothetic research might be saying something like people with a higher education level will likely earn a higher salary. It is a finding that can be applied to a large group of people, all people with a higher education level. To establish nomothetic causality, a research study often needs to establish three criteria. The first of those is correlation, which occurs when variables that we are studying are related to each other, such that changes in our independent variable will go hand in hand with changes in our dependent variable. We also have a time order component of nomothetic research. And the time order component determines that the actual order of changes from one variable to another matter, in such that changes in the independent variable occur first in time and are accompanied by changes in the dependent variable that occur later in time. So the order of variables establishes causality in nomothetic research. And we also have what's called non-spuriousness. And a spurious relationship is explained away by some third variable that may not have been considered in our research findings. And if we are to say that nomothetic research is causal, we have to say that it is non-spurious. There is no third variable that could be influencing our finding that our independent variable has caused a change in our dependent variable. And that is what we call non-spurious. We also have what's called idiographic research. And idiographic research really attempts to explain the entire realm of influences and every possible detail that has influenced a particular phenomenon or an event for an individual. Because we are focused on the individual, oftentimes nomothetic research is qualitative in nature. Idiographic research is known for being quite time consuming because it can investigate only one individual or event at a time because of the depth of truly capturing the information for that group or that person. But oftentimes, idiographic research fuels the later nomothetic research that we do. But it's an important tool that is used to investigate a problem at an individual level before it can ever be generalized to the society at large. So oftentimes, idiographic research is our starting point. It's what we need to fuel these larger research studies. So that's how we establish causality in research. But there's one particular research design or sort of category of research that you've probably heard about that you have maybe associated with causality, and that is the experimental design. And an experimental design is a study that includes an experiment and then analyzes the results of that experiment. So, what is an experiment? Well, probably what you're thinking of is what we call the classical experimental design. And the classical experimental design refers to the presence of a test, an experiment, an intervention, or some form of manipulation that's happening at the time of data collection. This is probably what you learned about in science class in high school, maybe even in college, but this is the classical experiment. And the classical experiment requires specific elements, and there are 3 required elements of a classical experiment. The first of those is the presence of a control group and an experimental group. We also have the breakdown of randomly assigning participants to the control group and the experimental group. And we also have the instance of pre and post testing, which refers to collecting data both before and after an experiment. So let's break each of these down into a little bit more detail. So when we're talking about experimental and control groups, let's start with some definitions. An experimental group is the group that undergoes some form of experimentation, such as in having your participants partake in a training, taking a test or a drug, or some other form of intervention. The control group then is the group that does everything the participants in the experimental group does, but they're not given that test, drug, intervention, or manipulation, although they may be told that they are getting that. And that's a specific type of control group that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. But the control group controls for all confounding or disturbing variables that could come up in your research. And by controlling for those things, you as the researcher can have confidence that your findings are accurate and that the outcome in your study was a consequence of the experiment rather than any extraneous reasons. So the control group ends up being the comparison group for the experimental group to say, by being exposed to this test or this drug or this manipulation, whatever it is, if there's a big difference between the experimental group and the control group, we can say that it is due to that change, that test, that drug, that manipulation. We also have random assignment. And random assignment is referred to as the way that you distribute your participants in a study. When you are ready to collect data, the first thing that you should do is randomly place the participants into the experimental group and the control group. And by doing this, by randomly telling participants which group they're in, you as a researcher can minimize the potential characteristics that could be a determining factor in your research. So if you let people select their own group, you might have people in your study who know each other. And they probably know each other because they have some similarities to one another. And if they are similar in some way, and now they're in the same group together, there could be a characteristic of that group that could be influencing your study. But as a researcher, if you're randomly assigning participants to either the experimental or the control group, you can minimize the effect of those characteristics. Random selection or random assignment can be accompanied in the number of ways that can be accomplished in a number of different ways. But usually as the researcher, you are aware of the groups, but the participants are unaware. So you might say that you're going to just randomly distribute them and they are going to just go about the study without recognizing that there is another group that's different from them. When that occurs, we call it a blind study, meaning that the participants don't know which group they're in. We also have the case of what's called double-blind studies, which occurs when both the researcher and the participants do not know which group is the experimental group and which group is the control group. In psychology, because the interventions are largely interpersonal, it's more difficult to establish double-blind studies, but we have double-blind studies a lot in the medical field, where you might have a placebo drug and an experimental drug that are being administered to groups, and all groups and all researchers are told that the control and the experimental or placebo drug are the same as the experimental drug, so that everyone thinks that they're in the experimental group, and then you can look for changes. I briefly mentioned this, that random assignment can be established in different ways. Sometimes it can be having your participants draw a number and having them just auto, based on their number, that's what group you're in, or you can use a computer generated number generator to determine which group people are in. It sort of varies by the researcher and what they choose depending on their research design. And that third component of experimental designs in the classical experimental study is pre and post testing, which is oftentimes used to help figure out the results of a study. So specifically, researchers need to pre-test all of their participants and then go on to post-test them to figure out the actual results of a study. So when we're talking about pre-testing, it means before you ever introduce your independent variable or whatever manipulation you're looking at, you get a baseline measure of your participants on your study of interest or your area of interest. Largely, this is your dependent variable. However you're measuring your dependent variable, you pre-test them, see where they're at before they've ever been exposed to the experiment. Then you engage in the experiment and you have them take a post-test. And you, as the experimenter, are going to look and see if there were changes from the pre-test to the post-test to determine if that change in your dependent variable is notable, if it's significant. In other words, the pre-test and the post-test are going to give us the information that we need to either support or reject our hypotheses. The pre-test and the post-test measures cannot be different from one another. They have to be the same. Even though that might feel uncomfortable as a researcher to say, yeah, I'm just having my participants do the exact same thing again, the pre-test and the post-test must be the same, because any differences in them could mean that they are manipulating the outcome. As a researcher, you're manipulating the outcome, or it could mean that the tests are changing the results that we're seeing. So one of the common experimental designs that is important to know about is what we call the Solomon four-group experimental design. And this is one of the most common experimental designs because it's a type of experimental design that helps to minimize measurement errors. Specifically, as you might have noticed, it can be uncomfortable to ask your participants to take your pre-test and post-test the exact same way and have the exact same measures. And some researchers came out and said, well, if I'm exposing my participants to the pre-test, they're going to know what I'm studying. And if they know what I'm studying, then they might change the way that they respond to the experimental manipulation. So the Solomon four-group design goes out and protects the results from this pretest bias, from any knowledge that the participant has based on the pretest that could influence their study results. And the way that it does that is by having two experimental groups and two control groups. And then within each of those two groups, one of the experimental groups and one of the control groups will take the pretest and the post-test, and the other experimental group and the other control group will only be exposed to the post-test and will not take the pretest. This particular design allows the researcher to clearly show whether the pretest is influencing the study results or the results of the study. So here's a little bit of a breakdown of what that experimental design looks like. So as I mentioned, you have two control groups, which is these top two, and you have two experimental groups. Within each of these categories, only one control group and one experimental group will experience both the pretest and the post-test, whereas the other control group and the other experimental group will only be exposed to the post-test. And again, the whole purpose of the Solomon four-group design is to minimize the effects of the pretest and how they might bias test results. Because if a participant knows what the researcher is looking for, they might engage or change their behavior in socially desirable ways. So they might change the way that they look, so change the way that they behave or how they respond so that it looks better to the researcher. And the Solomon four-group design will try to eliminate that. So that is an example of an experimental design that falls into almost the category of classic experimental design. But classical experimental design is not always possible. And because it's not always possible, we have another category of experimental designs that's called quasi-experimental designs. And these quasi-experimental designs conduct some form of intervention, testing, modification, or manipulation, and examine the results in the same way that you do an experimental design. But quasi-experimental designs are more relaxed in terms of the experimental design requirements, specifically around random assignment of participants for the control group and the experimental group, or around the pretest and post-test components. So there's a little bit more flexibility in that you don't need all of those things. There are some common quasi-experimental designs. Our book goes into these in greater detail, and I'm not going to go over them with you here just because there are great descriptions in our book, and really these designs are helpful depending on your specific study of interest. So if you're looking for a quasi-experiment in your own study, you can look at these in greater detail, but I really wanted you to just know what the difference is between a quasi-experiment and a classical experiment. So again, quasi-experiment is going to be relaxed in terms of random assignment of participants, and there's probably going to be less stringent requirements on pre-testing and post-testing. A lot of times quasi-experimental designs are used when you cannot randomly assign participants. So groups are automatically or generally categorized by themselves. So running an experiment and looking for manipulation based on whether or not someone identifies with a specific group. So maybe you're looking at identity factors. You're looking at sex assigned at birth, gender, things that you cannot randomly assign to a participant, but they have automatically been identified with and categorized in their own way. That would be a good example of a quasi-experiment. You can't randomly assign your participants, but the groups are naturally there and you can still do the study. We also want to talk about the difference between a non-experiment and a pre-experimental design. So non-experimental designs do not include any manipulation, such as any training, intervention, or drug of training. And you might be asking yourself, like, why do we even talk about experimental designs or non-experimental or pre-experimental designs if you're not including any manipulation? And the reason why we talk about them is because non-experiments and pre-experimental designs are crucial for researchers who are exploring something completely innovative. And these non-experiments and pre-experiments will then move into conducting classical experiments later. There are some common designs for non-experiments and pre-experiments, and those can include things like non-random cross-sectional studies and the longitudinal cohort studies. Both of these are great examples of non-experiments. And the pre-experiments or pre-experimental designs implies that these types of studies are conducted before the researcher establishes a need for the experiment. So we're using these as more of an exploration of different types of studies. So that is where we are going to wrap up our lecture on chapter 4. Join me for the next lecture on chapter 7, where we're going to continue talking about qualitative studies, or quantitative studies. I apologize.